And welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're talking about Joan Beaufort.
One day we will be remembered.
Joan Beaufort was English. She was born in 1404, 3 years after the death of Annabella Drummond, Queen of Scots. She was the English daughter of an earl named John Beaufort and his wife Margaret Holland. If you've been with me since season 1, those names may sound familiar. Joan's father was John Beaufort, son of Prince John of Gaunt and his nanny turned mistress turned third wife, Catherine Swynford, of season 1, episode 6 fame. Check out her episode for more details, but the short story is that John Beaufort and his siblings became retroactively legitimate as adults after his parents' marriage. The main agreement for that was that John, his siblings, or any of their descendants never come for the throne of England. But spoiler alert, some of their descendants were the entire Tudor royal family, so that's how that turned out. Joan's mother was Margaret Holland. Margaret's father was Thomas Holland, and Thomas's parents were Thomas Holland and Joan the Fair Maid of Kent. Remember them of season 1, episode 3 fame? Everyone comes back around again. So Joan was very much a part of the royal family, but not a senior member, not even really an official member since she wasn't in line for the throne. She was the daughter of an earl. She was probably too young to remember, but when she was about 2 years old, something pretty notable happened. English pirates had captured the heir to the Scottish throne. He was fleeing to France to flee his killer Uncle Rob, but he didn't get to France. The English pirates turned the 12-year-old boy over to the English king, King Henry IV. King Henry IV was the half-uncle of Joan Beaufort, both being descended from John of Gaunt and 2 of his wives. So King Henry IV was the 39-year-old King of England. His little niece was a 2-year-old baby, and he had a 12-year-old heir to the Scottish throne captured. When he found out that the Prince of Scots was headed to France for his education, he decided to keep him. King Henry IV said he knew how to speak French real good, and he would teach the princeling. When the King of Scots found out that the English king had his son, he promptly died. So the captured princeling was now the 12-year-old King of Scots. The king is dead. Long live the king. So this was an international incident. The English king had the Scottish king. He wasn't going to hand them over to the English enemies, the French. We are well inside the 100 Years' War at this point. The English and the French are arch nemesis. He also couldn't return him to Scotland for a couple of reasons. One, if he made it safely back, they would just send him to France again. And if his Scottish uncle got a hold of him, he was probably dead before he even got to France. They couldn't even ransom him because his killer uncle didn't really want him back. There was no ransom coming for this little king. If you're trying to match us up with season 1, we are in Joan of Navarre's episode. Season 1, episode 11. This is a heavy crossover episode. In England, Joan of Navarre had just married King Henry IV. So we don't have a ton of information on Joan's childhood, but I imagine she was living a comfortable life as the daughter of an earl in England. We will get back to her, I promise, but it wasn't obvious this early in her life that she would be an important character in this greater story. So back to Prince James, living his best Disney prince life. He was an orphan child king, imprisoned in a foreign country, running from a killer evil uncle. He was treated well in England and educated. And through that, he gained an appreciation for the English government, which is, of course, exactly what they were going for. They were trying to Anglify the little King of Scots. And it seemed to be working. James turned 18, 6 years into his captivity. He was then admitted to the royal household. He was a prisoner, but he was living in England like he was a guest, an imprisoned guest. But just a year into that, King Henry IV died, making his son, King Henry V, the new King of England. The king is dead. Long live the king. King Henry V didn't hold the same affection for King James that his father had. King James was no longer a guest. He was held in the Tower of London with his cousin Murdoch, son of his killer uncle, so sleep with one eye open. But a couple of years later, Murdoch was released because his father was running the country of Scotland and actually wanted his son back. His nephew James, not so much. James was pretty down. He was a king, in prison, and there was no real hope of being released anytime soon. In 1420, when James was still the imprisoned 26-year-old King of Scots, he was going on 14 years in captivity. He wrote a poem. This poem was named The King's Square. The poem is about a man who was on a sea voyage when he was 12. That sounds familiar. He gets put in prison for 18 years, and it is a bummer, and he believes himself to be the most miserable man living. So, spoiler alert, he was writing about himself, and it gives us a sense about how he was feeling at this point in his life. Not great. Back to the poem. The man sees out his tower window a beautiful woman who helps him get released from his captivity. And then there are dreams and goddesses. It's a whole story. The poem is 117 lines long. But since this is based on James' life, who is the beautiful woman? It's Joan. Our Joan, Joan Beaufort, half-cousin to the king, who has James jailed. Something to note, James was 14 years into his captivity when he wrote the story about a man who seemed like him that was put in captivity for 18 years. Put a pin in that. So in 1420, James was 26 and Joan was 16, the pretty girl on the outside of the tower. But King Henry V needed King James' help. The king was fighting the French in the 100 Years' War. Remember the Battle of Agincourt? And the Scots were helping the French. But the English king had the Scottish king. So he brought King James to the battle, and James ordered the Scots to surrender as their king. But they didn't. They worked for his evil Uncle Rob. So King Henry said, "Fair enough. All of you are traitors. And when I win, you will all be killed as such." It was kind of a war loophole. And then evil Uncle Rob, he died because he was 80. So he was no longer a threat, and his heir was the cousin that James had been imprisoned with just 5 years before. Were they trauma bonded? Maybe. Back in England, the King of England was now getting married to Catherine of Valois of Season 1, Episode 12 fame. We are flying through last season. Maybe we can put this 100 Years' War to rest with an Anglo-Franco marriage agreement. James sat next to the new Queen Catherine at her coronation banquet. The two kings were almost friends now. James really looked up to King Henry V's leadership style. So James saw his chance. Maybe he could get the king to allow him to marry his half-cousin, the beautiful Joan Beaufort. But not just yet. King Henry died of dysentery in 1422. So close, James. The king is dead. Long live the king. The new king was Henry and Catherine's son, who was not yet even 1 year old. So England had been thrown into a bit of an upheaval. They had a baby king and someone else's king held captive. The Regency Council was all, we have enough on our plates. Let's see if we can get rid of this King of Scots. Not in that they wanted to kill him. They wanted to release him. He was probably loyal to the English. And that would keep Scotland busy fighting each other and keep them out of the 100 Years' War. King James I, other uncle, Little Walter, remember him? He was really in favor of his nephew being returned. Not because of affection for his nephew, but because he really wanted the senior branch of his family taken out. Little Walter was Walter Lackland, and he resented his overly dramatic older brothers. If his nephew was returned, maybe the senior branch of the family would infight and take each other out for him. This was the deal. King James I would be released to go back and take Scotland after his uncle Rob's regency. The English had raised him, and they assumed they would receive his loyalty. For his release, James would pay £40,000 ransom for himself, minus 10,000 marks as a dowry, because King James was getting married to the beautiful girl outside the tower, Joan Beaufort. She went from being the daughter of an English earl to the Queen of Scots. That escalated quickly. Or not so quickly. 4 years had passed since James had written the poem, meaning that James was going to be released with the help of Joan after 18 years of captivity, just like the poem. Remember when I said put a pin in that 18 years? He was right. Now, was this a lucky guess? Editing after the fact? I don't know. But I'm going to go with maybe he was a time traveler or a seer, because that's more interesting. How did he know 4 years before that he would be captive for 18 years? If you know, let me know. So King James and his wife Joan Beaufort were off to Scotland to get their thrones back. And the English were hopeful that this was the start of a new alliance between the English and the Scots. The royal couple's first stop, Scone, to be crowned, obvi. And they were. The Queen was also already pregnant. 10 months after their marriage, the royal couple had their first baby, Princess Margaret. After their coronation, James met his cousin Murdoch, his old jail cellmate, and accepted his resignation on his late father's governorship. Murdoch didn't have the same following as his father Robert had. But while Uncle Rob had been running the country, the money was in trouble, in that the crown didn't really have money, and they owed the English a hearty ransom. The king was somewhat financially dependent on the Scottish nobles, so King James was a little forgiving for past infractions. The main exception was Murdoch's son, who was in open rebellion against his father for a lot of reasons, one of which was his disagreement about James's return. He was on his late grandfather's side, the no way James side. So King James was in a whole family drama, back in Scotland for the first time since he was 12. He was now 30. But it's airtime. Like I said earlier, they had their first baby 10 months after their wedding, Princess Margaret. 2 years later, Princess Isabella joined her sister, and right on schedule, her sister Princess Joan joined the family. Princess Joan, the royal couple's third child, was born deaf and mute. She used sign language to communicate, even though at the time, sign language was considered rude. 2 years later, Queen Joan was indeed expecting, right on schedule. And she really needed to provide a boy after 3 girls. A Scottish tale as old as time, many princesses, and can I get a boy? She did get a boy. In 1430, the 26-year-old Queen of Scots gave birth to twin boys, Alexander and James. Unfortunately, baby A, Alexander, died the day of his birth. It was difficult to have 2 healthy twins in the 15th century, but baby B, James, survived. And he was a healthy baby. He had a large birthmark on the side of his face that went from his forehead down to his chin. After the twins' birth, there was a slightly longer gap before more babies, but 3 years after, the Queen had another baby, Princess Eleanor. About a year and a half later, her sister, Princess Mary, joined her. And about another year and a half later, the royal family was completed with Princess Annabella. Final count, 8 children, with 7 surviving. They had 3 girls, then twin boys, of which 1 survived, and then 3 more girls. In 1437, Queen Joan of Scots was the mother of 13-year-old Margaret, 11-year-old Isabella, 9-year-old Joan, 7-year-old James, 4-year-old Eleanor, 3-year-old Mary, and 1-year-old Annabella. The king's uncle, little Walter, Walter Lackland, remember the old king's only son not to get a earldom? He saw his chance. His nephew James had gotten the country somewhat under control and had taken out most of his enemies. Little Walter was going to make his move. True to his nature, remember his feuding brothers? Little Walter staged a coup against his nephew James. In February 1437, the king and queen, along with some of her ladies, were in Perth, Scotland. The king was enjoying himself, playing tennis, was the pickleball of its time. There was a bit of a problem with the tennis courts. Near the tennis courts was the exit drain for the sewer. So it probably smelled a bit, but worse than that, King James kept losing his tennis balls down the sewer, so gross. He asked them to block the exits so he would stop losing balls, and they did. So tennis fun ensued. Later, the king, queen, and her ladies were in their room. The king had a guy that worked for him, his cousin's boy, Robert Stewart. This wasn't just a nepotism hire, it was also kind of an olive branch. Remember when James was a captive in England? Well, he said, "Let me go and I'll pay you the ransom myself," because his Uncle Rob was no help. The English had agreed on the condition that some men came to England as hostages, like collateral, in case he didn't pay. One of the men sent as hostage in his place was his cousin, David Stewart. David had died in captivity 3 years earlier, and his son was the young man working for the king. David's father was the king's uncle Walter. Remember little Walter Lackland? He's back, and his son had died in England, and his grandson was working for the king, and little Walter was a little angry about the situation. But he was also 77, so there wasn't much he could do about it on his own. If you've seen Game of Thrones, think Walder Frey. That's who old man little Walter reminds me of. So he made a plan, and this plan started with his grandson. All little Walter needed from his grandson was to leave the king's door unlocked. He was the inside man. And Robert did just that. He left the door unlocked for his grandfather's men. So the king, queen, and her ladies were in for the evening when they heard a commotion. There were angry men headed their way, but they had no escape route. Well, almost no escape route. The king was pretty sure that if he pulled up the floorboards, the sewer tunnel was right under their rooms. The smell of that room must have been awful. Gross. So the king grabbed a poker from the fireplace and just started pulling up floorboards and jumped down into the sewer because he was pretty sure those angry men were after him. While all of this was happening, the queen's ladies were bracing the door to give the king time to make his escape. After the king was down in the sewer, the floorboards were put back into place, and just in time, because the men busted in, breaking one of the queen's ladies' arms in the process. She was using her arm to brace the door, and they broke in, breaking her arm in the process. But they didn't see the king. Where could he be? There was some discussion about where he could have gone when one of Walter's men remembered the sewer and how it probably ran under this room. And they found the loose floorboards, and they were then also in the sewer on the hunt for the king. Now the king had quite a head start, but remember the tennis balls? The exit to the sewer had been blocked off on his orders, so he hit a dead end. The conspirators caught up with him, and he pleaded for his life, asking at least for a confessor. One of Walter's men allegedly said, "You shall have no confessor but this same sword." And then he killed the king in the sewers. Sad. And gross. But old man little Walter had his revenge, and his nephew the king was dead. But that wasn't the whole plan. Walter also wanted the queen dead. They started to kill her too, and she got a pretty big gash. But then one of the men was like, "We can't kill a woman. She's a woman. That's a bad look. Like, we can't just go around killing women." So they left her injured, but alive. The king is dead. Long live the king. The new king was Joan's 7-year-old son, James, and he was back at Edinburgh Castle. So Joan was like, "No time for the hospital. I need to get back to my son. They may be after my son next," and she rushed back to Edinburgh Castle. Was the coup successful? Absolutely not. They had managed to kill the king, but they didn't have popular support, and they didn't have custody of the new king. The queen mother did, and they were apprehended and attainted. All their lands and titles were forfeit to the crown. Uncle Walter Lackland was sentenced to death, but not your average death. he was tortured to death in a series of tortures that were considered hideous even for the time, on the orders of the Queen Mother. She was angry. The Scots weren't messing around. They were tired of the royal family infighting. So Uncle Little Walter was tortured to death, but not so little because he was now 77. On day 1, because this torture will last multiple days, on day 1, he was put in a cart with a crane and hoisted up violently and dropped to stretch out his joints. Probably arthritic joints at 77. Then he was placed on a pillory. If you don't know what a pillory is, you probably do. You see it in the movies all the time. It's the structure that holds your head and your hands. In the movies, oftentimes people throw rotten food at them. But elderly little Walter had a different experience. He was crowned, in heavy air quotes, with a crown of burning iron. Ow. With the inscription, King of all traitors. And that was just day 1. Day 2, he was bound to a hurdle and dragged through the high street of Edinburgh. Some stories claim he was blinded and tortured with red-hot iron pincers, but that may have been exaggeration. Day 3, he was disemboweled while alive, his entrails burnt before his face, and his heart was torn out and also burnt. Finally, his corpse was beheaded and quartered, and the quarters were displayed around the realm. It was like being hung, drawn, and quartered over the course of 3 days, with a red-hot crown and possible blinding and hot pincers. Yikes. Joan was all for this. 77 or not, Walter had led the coup that had killed her husband and left her, the 32-year-old single mother of 7 and dowager queen. She was like, yeah, torture that guy. He deserves it. But she only stayed powerful for about 3 months. The Scots didn't love the idea of an English woman as regent. The Scots chose Archibald Douglas as new regent. Remember when James' sister married Archibald the Loser? Their son was the new regent. But Queen Joan was allowed to retain custody of her now 7-year-old son, King James II. 2 years after her husband's death, Joan was looking to remarry, and she wanted to marry James Stuart. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wasn't her first husband James Stuart? Yes, her first husband was James Stuart, King of Scots. Her second husband was Sir James Stuart, a knight. So I guess Joan had a type, and that type was James Stuart's, exclusively. It's weirdly specific. And they needed permission from the Pope for both consanguinity and affinity, meaning that both of Joan's husbands were related to each other, but Joan was also related to the second James Stuart. I don't know how close, but close enough that they needed permission from the Pope. Joan's new husband, James Part II, was an ally of the new regent Archibald Douglas. At first, the Queen was kind of allied with William Crichton. Crichton had possession of Edinburgh Castle when the king was assassinated, and also custody of the new little king. He let the Queen Mother in, and they were in it to win it. Once the Queen was feeling a bit stronger, she started questioning if she could trust Crichton. Who all was in on little Walter's plan? Valid. She probably had some PTSD after that whole ordeal. I wouldn't know who to trust either. So she moved with her son away from Edinburgh Castle. Her late husband's nephew, Archibald Douglas, was regent because he was male and not English. Him and the Queen Mother decided they needed to overthrow Alexander Livingstone. He had control of Stirling Castle, and that was kind of a big deal. And they didn't want to be in charge there anymore. But word got to Livingstone, and he had Joan arrested by his men because possession is 9/10 of the law. He made Dowager Queen Joan a deal. Give me custody of your son, the king, and I'll let you go. Somehow he convinced her to agree to that deal. I have no idea. Maybe she thought that if she didn't, she would be killed and her kids would have no one left to protect them. I'm not sure. But I can't imagine agreeing to that deal. But I haven't lived the life Joan had. No judgment here. I don't know what I would have done. The king was now 9 years old, and she must have thought he would at least be somewhat safe with Livingstone. The next year, Livingstone teamed up with Crichton, probably because between them they had control of the two most important castles in Scotland, Edinburgh and Stirling, and custody of the 10-year-old king, who was still alive. The old regent and friend of the queen wasn't still alive. He had died from a fever, and his 16-year-old son was the new Earl Douglas. Livingstone and Crichton decided that since they were family, they would invite the new Earl and his younger brother over for dinner at Edinburgh Castle, to have dinner with their cousin, the king. Well, first cousin once removed, but the Earl was 16, his little brother was at least 10, and the king was 10, so age-wise they were peers. The Earl and his brother both agreed and came to dinner with the little king. They ate dinner, but then some accusations were made against the teenage Earl having more to do with his father than with him. They put on a show trial, found the boys guilty of the sins of their father, and while 10-year-old King James was crying and begging them not to, the men executed the Douglas brothers. This dinner became known as the Black Dinner. I say this a lot, but if you watch Game of Thrones, this dinner is what gave George R.R. Martin the inspiration for the Red Wedding. So that was pretty messed up. I can't imagine Dowager Queen Joan was too happy to find out what trauma had been thrust onto her only son. But she had no power and 6 daughters to think of, so there was nothing much she could do. The new Earl Douglas was the uncle of the 2 murdered boys, and he was probably pretty mad at the men who killed his nephews. Except he wasn't. He was their pal. They were bros, so that's suspicious. Your friends kill your nephews, and you're still just cool with them? He was giving off Richard III vibes. Please don't come for me, Richard III Society. I respect you. I just don't agree with you. I'm sorry. So there he was, James, Earl Douglas, and he decided that the Queen was a problem. The Queen was at Dunbar Castle, and James Douglas laid siege. But at this point, we are 5 years after the Black Dinner. Douglas was feeling pretty powerful with his pals Crichton and Livingstone, and they didn't need the Queen Mother meddling with their ward, the 15-year-old King James. Joan didn't need to make a plan about how to get out of this mess, because while her castle was under siege, she died at the age of 40 or 41. I don't know what she died of. It could have been any number of things, but being trapped under siege couldn't have helped. She was survived by her husband, Sir James Stuart, and 7 of her children. Margaret, age 20, who had died just a month later, that's a whole episode all by itself. Isabella, age 18. Joan, age 16. King James, age 15. Eleanor, age 12. Mary, age 11, and Annabella, age 9. And that is where I'll leave it for now. This was a sad one, guys. It started with a Disney-style prince orphan in captivity who fell in love with a pretty girl outside of his tower. And when he finally went home, his family betrayed him until both him and the pretty girl outside the tower were both dead, leaving their 7 children, ages 11 to 20, orphans too. I can't do much to make this episode not sad, but think fondly back on Joan watching her husband playing tennis and losing his tennis balls into the sewer. That was probably the last time they were happy together. You can get in touch with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next time, bye.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.